Thanks, Danny. So we thought we would start with a video that the Conservancy put together. Hang on, let's pause it for a second. So just before that starts, and it will mean my slide talk later is a lot shorter, which is really good for you guys. The Glossy Black Conservancy is a consortium of local governments and researchers and private NGOs and the birdlife groups and governments, local governments particularly, which basically has been working on Glossy Black Cockatoo conservation probably since around about 2005. So our organisation, which is Healthy Land and Water, has been a partner in the Conservancy since the early days, a couple of years after it actually started. And recently Jani's joined us on the Conservancy as well. Basically what the Conservancy aims to do is build community awareness of the status of Glossy Black Cockatoos and work with partners to improve the status of the species and improve conservation outcomes. So the Conservancy basically put this, what did you just do? Oh, right. So the Conservancy's basically now put out, recently done with Daniella's fantastic support, a little video about Glossy Black Cockatoos, which is it's a beautiful little film, and as I said, much better than my slideshow, so we'll just play that one. And we should also pay our respects to the traditional elders in the land that we're meeting today, and our regards to elders past, present and emerging. So I'll just... I think it's the Yagara people this way, aren't we?
Cockatoos are a large black cockatoo found
Can you hear that?
in Australia. They're intelligent social birds, and males and females pair up in long-term relationships.
That's on Max.
Room's perfect.
I need to just go back to start. Sorry?
I'm so pleased these educated people have the same trouble as
everywhere you go. You can try it out at home and then you get to a venue and you use all the same plugs and still. There we go.
Where's the video taken? Is it just in general or is it taken here somewhere?
Locally made, not right here, but it's in the local area.
Glossy Black Cockatoos are habitat specialists. They only eat seeds of she oak trees, also known as casuarinas.
No, thanks, Ben.
Glossy Black Cockatoos are a large black cockatoo found across eastern Australia. They're intelligent social birds, and males and females pair up in long-term relationships. Glossy Black Cockatoos are habitat specialists. They only eat seeds of she oak trees, also known as casuarinas. In fact, they're super fussy eaters and even have their favourite tree that they feed on while ignoring other trees that to us look pretty good. So this specialised diet, in addition to habitat loss and low reproductive rates, means that glossy black cockatoos are a threatened species, and scientists rely on reports from the public to know where glossies are and what they're up to. This video will help you identify glossies by sight and sound. Across their range, glossy black cockatoos overlap with two other similar-looking species of black cockatoo, the yellow-tailed black cockatoo and the red-tailed black cockatoo. Yellow-tailed black cockatoos are easy to identify because, as their name suggests, they have yellow tails. They also have a distinct yellow cheek patch. Their call is also unique. It's a squeaky, wailing sound, and yellowtails are often seen in large flocks. Red-tailed black cockatoos look similar to glossies because, like glossies, they have red in their tails. Compared to glossies, red tails are noisier, they're normally seen in bigger flocks, and they mostly occur in different habitats. While glossies are typically seen in areas with lots of she oaks or casuarinas, red tails will occur across a range of different environments. Male glossy black cockatoos are brownish black all over, except for their bright red tail feathers. Female glossy black cockatoos are also brownish black, but they have yellow patches across their face and their head. Females' tail feathers are also red, usually with some yellow or orange in there, and they have black bars across them. Some older females, these bars will fade over time, and some females don't have much yellow on their head, so sometimes females can look a bit like a male. Young males, who are independent from their parents but have not yet found a mate, can be identified by their tail feathers. Unlike adult males, young males have black bars in their tails, but unlike females, their tails are only red. Fledglings, or young birds who are still dependent on their parents, can be identified most easily by their clumsy behaviour and by their incessant begging for food. Young fledglings can be quite spotty in the chest and on their shoulders, and these spots fade over time as they age. Even if you don't see glossy black cockatoos, there are two other easy ways to detect them. The first is their unique call. The most commonly heard call is a grating, harsh call. Glossies will also make softer calls while they're feeding to stay in touch with one another. In fact, another way to find glossies is by listening out for the sound of the cracking shear of cones as they feed on them. While feeding, glossies make a mess, leaving behind the chewed up remains of the shear cones that they fed on. Scientists call these remains orts or chewings. If you see orts under a shear tree, that's a sure sign that glossies have been there. It can be difficult to tell apart glossy black cockatoos from other species, so it's always a good idea to confirm your sighting with a photo, a video, or even a sound clip. You can always get in touch with us at the Glossy Black Conservancy to confirm your sighting. Now that you know how to identify glossy black cockatoos, please submit your sightings to the Glossy Black Conservancy. You can do this on our website at glossyblack.org.au. And remember, every sighting helps us understand more about this magnificent bird and contributes to their conservation.
Thanks all. So now I've realised just how useless my presentation's going to be. All right, so I might scoot through some things a little bit quickly because I had forgotten about our presentation, our little video, and it does cover off on a lot of things. So glossy blacks in southeast Queensland and northern New South Wales, that's pretty much the scope of where the Conservancy does its work. So we've got partners extending from Tweedshire. Previously was Byron, but up as far as Fraser Coast we've got partners, but our main focal area is really southeast Queensland. I've got to remember how to work this one. There we go. So I mentioned before what the role of the Conservancy is. Our aim is to basically raise awareness, coordinate conservation across the landscape and collect data on glossy black cockatoos and also undertake key research that helps actually inform those management actions. So the Conservancy is like a quasi-recovery team for the glossy black cockatoo, but we have a narrow geographic area and our aims are very action-oriented. So that's our partners this year. I won't spend too much time on that one. And we've got friends. That's our system of management basically has those different membership levels depending on the capacity of organisations to contribute to what the Conservancy is doing. So reiterating in terms of that idea, you probably picked up from that video, glossies, they're called glossies. They do in some lights actually look a little bit glossy, but normally you see them, they're looking like a chocolatey brown colour. They're not really, you know, what you think of as a glossy coloured bird. As the video mentioned, males are fairly uniform in colour with red tail, with barring when they're juvenile, and the adult females have different levels of yellow around their head. You can tell the age and gender from the tail feathers, so that was discussed in the video as well. So again, I'm really reiterating a lot of those messages. You can see here with the male cockatoos that they lose the barring as they mature. So you can actually really get a sense of whether a bird is at non-breeding age or at breeding age by the level of barring in their feathers. And we do ask for that information in the sightings database that's online as well. The more you can tell us about the glossies that you see, the better we can try and understand what's going on in local landscapes. And as Daniella pointed out in the video, not in person, there's a lot more yellow in the feathers of a female cockatoo. So glossies are Australia's smallest black cockatoo. There are 3 species, as evidence in the video, that occur of black cockatoos that occur in southeast Queensland. They have a feeble call, you've heard that before. In every state where glossy black cockatoos are found, they are considered to be vulnerable under the state legislation, the exception being South Australia, this tiny little population on Kangaroo Island, which is considered endangered by that state government and endangered nationally. So glossies aren't endangered at a national level or even listed under the federal environmental legislation, though they are threatened in every single state in which they occur. So it's considered that most populations are in decline. I think the only population that's not is the northern population up here, but pretty much throughout eastern Australia, this population or subspecies, which is Calyptorhynchus lathami in the blue, is considered to be declining, and that's even especially more so with the recent impacts of fire throughout a lot of their range. In southeast Queensland alone, we think we've lost probably about 50,000 hectares of their habitat through the main range area, with the extent of fires was sort of over 70,000 hectares. So huge impacts on these birds, which were already in decline. Hard to gauge the number of birds. This was a national estimate from quite a few years ago of less than 18,000. 18,000 may sound that's like a lot of birds, but you'll hear why that's not really a lot of birds in terms of for glossy black cockatoos. We've gone through the similar species, so we've got yellow-tailed in southeast Queensland, quite a different looking bird, bigger, blacker, very consistent yellow patterning on it and a very different call. Red-tailed blacks, again, quite a different bird. I won't focus on those because we have just looked at them, but they are quite different. We don't get a lot in southeast Queensland. We don't get a lot of red-tailed black cockatoos anyway. You do in some of these western spaces, you'll get groups of them moving through, but again, very different habitat. And once you get to know them, a very different bird. So why are glossies so rare? They are a niche specialist. They have very specific habitat requirements, and they're limited by those habitat requirements, their diet and their breeding behaviour. This is compounded then by those other pressures. So when you lose massive extents of habitat through fire and potentially breeding spaces, all those, and drought as well, before that, you've got a compounding effect on these species, on the species. So specialised diet, as the video mentioned, they feed only on the seeds of she oak cones. They only feed on maybe 1 to 2 she oak species in any given location where they occur. And they rarely, only very rarely, will extend their diet to other Casuarina species or even to other species of other tree species as well. The species that they use in any given location varies geographically. So on the coast in southeast Queensland, we find that they feed on the horse-tailed she oak, Casuarina equisetifolia, and often Allocasuarina littoralis. Out here, it's typically Allocasuarina littoralis and torullosa, they're the common ones, but in some areas in the lochia, they're feeding on the thready bark she oak, the Casuarina inifloa. We've also got them feeding on balar in some of the brigalow country as well. So usually 1 to 2 species in any one of those locations. Full list of species. So this is the full list in southeast Queensland of she oak species that they feed on. It looks like an impressive list, but as I said, usually in each location they're only feeding on 1 to 2 species. And some of these, like Mount Emu she oak, that's a rare species in its own right with a really restricted distribution. So it's not giving the glossies much across their range. But there's a fair range of species there. There's a couple here actually that aren't, well, we'll go into it in a minute. We're going to get, there's a couple listed there that aren't glossy feed trees, which are very common, and I'll talk about them in a minute. So the primary food trees I just mentioned, so littoralis and torullosa, as we call them, or the forest she oak and the black she oak are probably the most common, most dominant species around southeast Queensland and northern New South Wales, and that's what the glossies are feeding on. You can see there the bark of the two is a bit harder to see there. This bark of the torullosa is a bit more corky, a bit flaky almost. Littoralis is quite hard. That picture didn't work out very well. The seed, the cones are quite different looking, and if you pulled apart these needles, you'll see that the number of little teeth or little ridges that join those segments together, if you count the teeth, there's different numbers. That's if you want to get your magnifying glass out and have a look. But generally the typical shape and feature of the trees is quite different. A couple of the supplementary food trees that they also feed in this region, I mentioned the thready bark she oak or inifloa, and I think I've seen them feeding on that down at Longgrass Nature Refuge out in the lochia. Lumini, that's actually probably way more west of the range, just over the other side from Toowoomba. We do have balar, Casuarina cristata in our brigalow areas around the region as well, and glossies do feed on those. A couple of common she oaks that we have in southeast Queensland they don't feed on. Well, rarely feed on. We can't say never, because there have been some recent reports, and I think it's a consequence of drought compounded by fire, of people are seeing glossies trying to have a go on these species. Okay, so we're talking about river she oak. This is the one that you see along all your waterways and your rivers in southeast Queensland. When you compare the size of its cone to those of Torolosa and LLRIs, it's a lot smaller. So, you know, I guess the sentiment is that the amount of effort they would have to go to feed on those ones is a lot more than on the other species, hence it's not a preferred food tree. Another one is Casuarina glauca, which is found in those swampy coastal communities, and it doesn't seem to feed on those ones either. Again, they're both quite common where they're found, but the glossies aren't known to feed on them. As I mentioned before, they're only feeding on 1 to 2 species generally in any location in which they occur, but even within those 1 to 2 species, they are what we call fussy feeders. They will only feed on some trees with any population of trees. So we've done extensive work down here in Hidden Vale property, and you've got hundreds of thousands of she oak species. Only some of those she oaks that are fruiting have those orts that was mentioned in the video underneath them. Some she oaks look exactly the same. They're growing right next to each other. They're not using that one, but they're using that one extensively. So glossies are quite picky about which trees in any given species that they'll occur on. They do show fidelity though. Once you have found a glossy black food tree, chances are every time that tree fruits, the glossies will come back and visit. And you'll be able to see evidence of new fresh orts underneath the tree. So you'll be able to get a pattern of usage by looking at the orts under a tree. We might even, we won't pass these around because that's probably not a good COVID thing. But you can have a look. These are quite old, but they're the really old orts that you find on a tree will be almost grey, like an ashy grey colour. They're really washed out and very old. You'll get to these ones. These are quite some months old, through to the fresh ones, which almost look like you've got a carpet of snow underneath a tree. You know, they're really fresh, they're white, those orts. So you can tell just how, you see them in the picture there, just how recently a glossy may have been feeding, and you can dig down and find those older orts and check the colouring to see that there is usually that long-term use of a particular few trees. So it's estimated that only maybe 1% of the available she oak trees in an area might actually be used by glossies. Which is, I guess, when you see how many she oaks we do have in the landscape, when you see that they're pioneer species, when you see that they come up like, you know, hairs on a dog's back is the expression I've often heard used, you think there's plenty of food out there, but glossies are really picky about which trees, and that is not working in their favour at the moment. So I've just mentioned there the orts, I call them, oops, too many slides, like a trail of breadcrumbs. And that's one. You know, for many of our rare and threatened species, they're hard to find, which glossies can be, but glossies leave a little trail behind them. You know, the birds don't have to be there. You can just, not just look up and use your ears, but if you're looking down on the ground, maybe looking for some ground orchids, Martin, or something like that, you may find orts on the ground. So it's important to look up and look down, because if you find those, as the video mentioned, that's absolutely 100% evidence that you've had a glossy feeding in that tree. You don't have to hear or see the bird. That is good enough information. And we want records of feed trees, they're just as important in our data as records of the birds themselves, because they tell us where the birds are using trees in the landscape, and those are important foraging resources. It was mentioned in the video, again, cracking cones. They do make a very distinctive clicking sound. You might not hear the birds because they are very quiet, unlike the other 2 species of black cockatoo. They will sit quietly in a tree for hours, moving from one branch to another, pretty much defoliating it of all the ripe cones at that time. But you'll just hear that clicking, and they generally, like most cockatoos, they're generally left-handed, so they'll be using their left-footed I should say, to hold and manoeuvre the cones. Another thing that doesn't work in glossy's favour is they are hollow dependent. So they're going to need a tree to grow to 100, 200 or more years old to form big enough hollows in it that they can nest in there and breed their young. So, and generally in species like we've got Pteroticornis there, which we do have on Hidden Vale here, there certainly are some big old trees in this landscape, and it's really important that we can try and find out where the glossies are breeding and understand and map what they're doing, and some of the acoustic stuff is really helpful in that space. In terms of their breeding behaviour, the female sits in the hollow for 3 months looking after those eggs and young. In that time, She is totally dependent on that male bird going out and getting enough food for him and for her. He comes back every afternoon to a nearby tree, lets her know, she pops out, he regurgitates to her, she goes back in, and then when she's got hatched young, she feeds them from that. So the male bird is working his little tail feather off while she's in that nesting with young, because he's feeding her and their babies and himself in that space. So it's a really intensive time for them, and it's a time when they really need to have the maximum access to water and to food resources. So in terms of the other thing in glossies, because, you know, we've talked about the fact that their food resource, they're very fussy. We've talked about the fact that they're hollows, with their hollow dependent, so they need big old trees and landscapes which are declining dramatically in southeast Queensland. They also reproduce very slowly, so the capacity for them to build population numbers is incredibly slow. So they're only laying 1 to 2 eggs, and usually only 1 young survives out of those 2. And they spend so much time looking after that young that they're only breeding every 2 years. So they're getting 1 new bird into an area every couple of years if that bird survives to maturity. So it's not like rabbits, which reproduce really quickly, and you can see it go from two animals to hundreds in the space of only a few years. Really slow population growth with these ones. And the birds, as I said, dependent for at least 12 months, you'll see them hang around. So a lot of parental care, a lot of investment of time and energy by mum and dad into making sure that that young grows up. If it doesn't survive, well, interesting too there, if it doesn't survive, they will lay the next year. So if they lay, that's why it says 1 to 2 years, generally, because if they're not successful in that first year, they will rebreed, but otherwise they're looking after that one, and they've spent 2 years of their life looking after it. Just thought I'd throw in this pretty slide that Guy Castley, who's also on the Conservancy, put together to give you a kind of an idea of how much time glossies spend in a day doing individual activities. And obviously they spend most of their time feeding. They're generally sitting in an area with nice ripe she oak cones and pulling them out of the cones and leaving a mess behind them. So a little bit of time perching and preening in the mornings. Most of the day is spent feeding with a little bit of a break around lunch, like we all like to do, have a bit of a snooze, a bit of a preen. And the afternoon is a really good time for actually going and checking out water holes and puddles to see if the birds are coming in to drink. Being seed eaters like finches and things like that, they need to have water. They need to go to a water hole and drink regularly. They're not getting that water from their food source. We have in the Conservancy done a couple of events where we've tried to stake out water holes. I've been out here at Hidden Vale down at dinner camp, checking out the water hole there. And we'll talk a little about the water in a minute because it was on a bit of an eye-opener for me. So southeast Queensland is a regional stronghold for Glossy Black Cockatoos. It's considered, well, at least until the fires hit us, that this part of the world has got really quite robust populations with good extensive habitat. In a lot of other areas, they're becoming much harder to observe. That just reiterates what we said before, so we'll move on. Mention about water. So water availability is critical, but I don't think there's anything there about water quality. So when I came out to Hidden Vale quite a few years ago now, it's 2018 I think, and we staked out in October the dinner camp water hole. We came out during the day and I sussed out the section of creek. I thought, oh, I know where they'll go. There's that beautiful pool of fresh water perched in the top of this rock, and it's nice and fresh. So I was like, right, I bet they'll come here. And we went and sat and we waited, looked at a few other areas, and then we heard them come in. And where they went, I think there ended up about 9 birds in all came in to this one water hole. Because it was dry times, and that's what they do, they'll come to their food. And they climbed down this branch into this skanky puddle in the bottom of the creek that was dry, that the cattle had been in. It was all algae and everything, and I'm like, why would you go there, down into the incised creek bank, rather than that lovely pool of water over there? But who knows, that's where they went. They do have scouts up there, so somebody goes down to drink, but somebody's staying up to watch out for danger, because obviously when they're down on the ground, they're very vulnerable. We also know that they use things like potholes. There's a glossy in that hole, getting a drink. There's quite a few places up on the Sunshine Coast. There's a local school up there at Sunshine Beach. They're regularly drinking out of puddles in the car park. You know, they've been known to drink out of culverts at the side of roads. They visit frog ponds and dams and purposely built places as well for them. On the southern Moreton Bay Islands, they are only using human water resources, things that people put out bird baths, and they actually come and visit them. So they don't mind where they get their water from, but it has to be fairly easily accessible and, you know, as per this, a good visibility about what's coming around, or scouts watching out for you. One thing with glossies is, again, some of the threatened species in our region, you have to go into really remote wild places of southeast Queensland to find them. You don't with glossies. We've got them in our coastal forests. There's a stack of sightings coming through from Toohey Forest at the moment, not usually seen there. There were, you know, more irregular occurrences there, but there's lots of people seeing them at Toohey Forest. Up at Sunshine Beach, they're visiting planted she oaks in some of the parklands up there. So they're quite able to adapt to being in urban environments as long as the right trees are there, as long as there's hollows there somewhere nearby where they can breed. So what it means for glossy black cockatoos, though, is that we've got a really fantastic opportunity to engage everybody in their conservation. And the conservation in urban areas can be as important for a particular pair and its territory as conservation of those wild places as well. There's certainly a role for those urban resources. So if you've got the right she oak trees, the glossies don't care that it's planted, it's in a parkland, or it's a bit of regrowth, or a little bit of strip along the edge of a roadside, or whether it's an intact forest in our World Heritage National Parks. They don't really mind as long as it's got what they're looking for in terms of a food resource. So there's a big program up on the sunny coast. We've got people going around putting signs up and letting the council know these trees in this parkland or this scrappy bit of road reserve are important because the glossies are feeding on them. And that's where the community is really, really important, taking that local action. So conservation for the species is not easy because of some of those factors we talked about before. So they're highly mobile. These birds travel 20 kilometres or more feeding and foraging each day from their roost site out into those areas. Because their fussiness for food and it's scattered over broad landscapes, we need multiple people to be involved in conservation. We can't just go, well, that's the job of national parks because that's where they live. They don't. They live in the national parks and the private property there and that local government reserve there and, you know, and. So we need to have conservation action coordinated, which is where the Conservancy is trying to bring that coordinated actions together. Also, their food trees, those she oaks, often pioneers in disturbed areas. So you might have a fire come through and all the she oaks come up. But over time, those resources are lost from the landscape as other species come up and replace them in the landscape. So over time, the availability of she oaks in a landscape will decline. That's just part of how the succession within those ecosystems takes place. So they're losing food trees, which always means across the broad landscape, we need to have all those processes happening at different parts of over a series of time, I should say. So you can't have everything at the same stage. You've got to have some spaces in regrowth, some places in maturity, some places sort of at the more succession, what's the word I'm after? Declining stage. In the same way as their food trees are pioneers and often in disturbed areas and they become less common, we talked before about the fact that they rely on old trees. In urban areas, old trees with hollows are declining at a rapid rate. They're generally seen as a hazard to people because they have a chance of falling over. So in a lot of our urban reserves, people actually go through and take out the old trees with the hollows because they present a threat to people and life and property. In our rural landscapes, we've got much more opportunity to retain some of those big old trees. And glossies don't mind if that big old tree is one tree in a paddock surrounded by grassland and cattle, or a tree hidden in a forest. We've got records of them in single trees, in isolated trees in paddocks, breeding in those ones. So it just reiterates the importance of those hollows and protecting those trees, particularly for things like fire. So you have those big old trees on your property and you've got a chance of a wildfire. Part of your plan, it'd be ideal, is to protect that tree from fire by raking around it, stopping the fire get into it. Having hollows means it could be hollow on the inside. The chance of the flames going up and really destroying that tree are fairly high. So improving knowledge and our understanding of glossies, their range and how they petition those resources. Which sheoaks do they use in which parts of the landscape? How do they move between them? Where are their nesting sites? Where's their roosting sites? Where's their water? Is really important information to help us sort of to achieve that coordinated management. And the Conservancy is very keen to always have the community involved in monitoring glossies. As I said before, you can find orts. You don't have to be, you know, an expert birder or anything to find glossies. You can go and find orts on the ground and there you've got them. So we're really in the Conservancy trying to encourage people to get out there, understand what glossies look like, their habitats, find them, record them, and tell us what's going on in your local region, whether that's seasonal data about when they use things. That information has actually informed how the Conservancy runs our annual birding days. We've been alternating between May and October because in some areas people said, we don't get the birds in May, we always get them in October. In other areas people said the reverse. So we've switched the cycling around so we can actually try and capture some of that effort. And that came through community feedback on community monitoring of glossies in their landscapes. So how you can help? We really want people to get out there looking for glossies and telling us about them. That's the first thing. We do targeted works and incidental surveys. As I said, we have our annual birding day. Stay tuned. We are really revamping the birding day for next year. It's going to be the best it's ever been. So make sure you're checking out and keeping in touch with us from Facebook as to when that's happening and when the volunteer training. We do some training on that just to make sure people do know what species they're doing and are familiar with our recording forms and things like that. If you do see glossies, to tell people, so whether it's your local council or through the Conservancy's portal, important to tell us about that information. And things you can do on your own property are things like conserving sheoaks and hollow-bearing trees. The Conservancy uses this data. It's not just a place you put your data information in and it's a big black hole. We've used that to develop habitat mapping to give to councils to go, you apply the precautionary principle in these areas because we think there's glossies in there. So before you do anything, go and check it out. So it's that feedback loop is active and working in the case of glossies. This is the kind of information to collect. You know, where did you see the bird? When did you see the bird? What was it, a male bird, a female? You know how to do that now. If you can tell us about how old it was and look at the patterns of yellow, that can be really helpful for actually monitoring female birds in a landscape. So female birds have that very different yellow patterning on their head from each other. You can map one particular bird moving through a landscape by her yellow pattern. There won't be any other female bird that looks like her. So it's like fingerprinting, it's unique. It will change over time with molting, but it's a subtle change over time. So if you're watching a bird and your neighbour's watching one, take some pictures and share them. Give them names. We've heard of names like, oh, this one, I don't like this one, yellow megahead. And it's not pretty, but you can think up some really nice names, you know, Sparkles or something, you know, and say, have you seen Sparkles? Because you know it's the same bird because you can match your photos and see what she looks like. So photos of birds are good, and photos of orts are just, you know, good confirmation anyway. We use that data to assess population numbers. We've written conservation guidelines. It's being reviewed. I think Danny's involved in that review at the moment because we've learnt so much over the past, how many years is it since that was written? 10 years, wow. 10 years since that document was written. So we're updating that at the moment to include what we've learnt through our birding days and the incidental information that's captured on through our portal and those targeted research projects that the Conservancy's been undertaking since that time. As I said, we can distinguish family groups. You know, different families eat orts a different way. There's a different pattern to the ort. I can't actually tell that, but I know some of the people with much better knowledge on that can tell that you get some turn the ort like this, some turn the ort like that, so they have different patterns of how they get the seeds out. We can, with using orts, the time since or the frequency of feeding events is useful, and how many trees in an area are being used for feeding at any given time. So that's pretty much it. Informed management is imperative, and it's coordinated conservation. So, and it's not just government's responsibility, it's all of ours. You know, if we've got glossies on your property and you can tell people about them, then we can learn about those ones. And if your neighbours aren't participating, that's okay, because we know what's going on in a general area, and we can work with local governments about this is the corridor that Glossy's using, or there seems to be a gap between here and here and we need to do a planting in this location. So the more you can participate, the more you're out there looking for Glossies and telling us about them, that would be good. That's our email address, thanks to BAM Ecology, who pretty much started the Glossy Black Conservancy 15 years ago. And there's our website. Oh, sorry, I meant to put the little Facebooky logo, but we have got a reasonably active Facebook site as well. We've got lots of stories coming through there, and we share information from KI on that one as well. So that's it from me. Sorry, I don't know if I've gone over time. No? Good. Okay. I have brought my little show and tell, some feathers and some orts, so you know what they look like. But it might be better in maybe a break to have a look at them. And I know I just touched them, but maybe don't touch them. That'd be great. Thanks, guys.